They were handed envelopes with American stamps and unfamiliar handwriting. And at first they assumed it was paperwork or inspection material. But when they realized the letters were meant for them to read and keep, confusion replaced expectation, because prisoners do not normally receive friendly word from the country holding them. And as they turned the envelopes in their hands, noticing careful writing from people they had never met, one quiet question settled in their minds. Why would strangers from an enemy nation choose to write to men they did not know and were never meant to meet? The envelopes were placed on the table without ceremony, stacked in a small, uneven pile, and at first glance they looked like ordinary administrative mail, the kind of papers that move through camps for record keeping, lists, or official notices. And none of the men leaned forward with curiosity, because experience had taught them that most documents inside a camp concerned rules rather than personal matters. The paper itself appeared different from the forms they usually saw, lighter in color, thinner in texture, and marked with stamps that carried American symbols instead of military headings. And this detail alone drew a few longer looks, because small visual differences often signaled a different purpose. And prisoners learned to read objects carefully, since objects sometimes revealed intention before words did. A guard indicated that the letters were permitted for them to read, and the tone was casual rather than formal, which created the first layer of confusion, because permission in captivity normally followed clear categories, and unclear categories forced the mind to slow down and interpret, and several men exchanged brief glances as if silently confirming that they had understood correctly. No names were called at first, and no instructions followed, which made the moment feel unstructured, and unstructured moments inside a controlled environment often felt more uncertain than strict ones, because structure provides mental footing while openness removes it, and without footing the mind hesitates before acting. When the envelopes were finally handed out one by one, the men accepted them with measured movements, not out of excitement, but out of habit, because quick reactions rarely served them well in captivity, and the handwriting on the fronts varied widely, some neat and careful, others uneven and personal, and none of it resembled official script. They noticed that the senders' names were unfamiliar and clearly civilian, and this detail quietly shifted the meaning of the letters, because civilian communication carried a different weight than military paperwork, and the idea that a private individual had written to a prisoner of war introduced a situation none of them had practiced how to interpret. Some turned the envelopes over in their hands before opening them, feeling the thin fold of paper inside, as if the physical texture might reveal the purpose. And this careful handling reflected more than caution. It showed how rarely they received anything that felt personal rather than procedural. The room remained mostly quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of paper and small movements. And this silence was not enforced, but natural, because each man was processing the same question privately, trying to understand why a stranger outside the camp would choose to send words to someone defined officially as the enemy. A few wondered whether the letters were part of a program, an organized effort meant to present a certain image. And this interpretation felt logical, because wartime often involved messaging beyond the battlefield, and prisoners were familiar with the idea that information could serve many purposes. Others considered a simpler explanation, that some civilians might see correspondence as a human gesture rather than a political one, and this thought did not immediately resolve the confusion, but it expanded the range of possible meanings. And expanding possibilities was something they had learned to do quietly in order to avoid quick conclusions. As the first envelopes began to open, the situation still felt uncertain, not threatening and not reassuring, but undefined, and undefined moments required patience, because meaning often appeared only after careful reading, and until then the letters remained what they were physically, thin sheets of paper carrying unknown intention from beyond the fences. When the first letters were unfolded, the men did not read them quickly because reading in captivity often carried weight, and weight required attention, and many of them moved their eyes slowly across the lines, translating in their minds where necessary, measuring tone as carefully as content, because tone sometimes revealed more than the message itself. The language inside the letters did not resemble official communication, and it did not contain commands, warnings, or instructions, but simple sentences written in a personal voice, asking about health, daily life, and conditions inside the camp. And this simplicity itself felt unusual, because official writing tends to sound distant, while these words sounded direct and human. Some letters mentioned families, farms, towns, or schools, small details about ordinary life. And these details created images of places far removed from fences and barracks, places where daily routines followed civilian rhythms instead of military schedules. And reading about such normality reminded the prisoners how different their own days had become. Several men paused midway through reading, not because the text was difficult, but because the intention behind it was unclear, and uncertainty often slowed comprehension more than language did, because the mind searched for purpose before accepting meaning. A few letters included polite expressions of hope that the recipients were being treated fairly, and this phrasing added another layer of complexity, because it suggested concern without authority, and concern from a stranger was not something they had learned to expect in wartime. They did not interpret the letters as friendship and did not interpret them as strategy either, but held both possibilities in mind, because captivity encourages cautious interpretation and balanced thinking felt safer than strong conclusions. The handwriting itself revealed individuality, some lines steady, some uneven, some carefully spaced, and these small human variations reinforced that real people had written the words, not offices or agencies, and recognizing individuality inside an enemy nation quietly complicated the simple categories war often creates. No one reacted loudly or displayed visible emotion, because open reaction could invite misunderstanding, and restraint had become second nature. And yet the atmosphere in the room carried a shared awareness that this situation differed from routine paperwork. Some men reread certain lines, focusing on neutral phrases, trying to understand whether the purpose was cultural, charitable, or informational, and each interpretation remained tentative, because certainty required context they did not yet have. They were also aware that correspondence programs sometimes existed during war, organized through humanitarian channels, and this possibility offered a practical explanation that neither exaggerated kindness nor assumed hidden motives, and practical explanations often felt the most stable. Still, the experience remained personal on a small scale, because each letter was addressed to an individual, and individual attention carries a different meaning than general announcements, and even in a structured system, individual messages stand apart. By the time most had finished reading, the letters had not changed their situation and had not altered camp routine, but they had introduced a quiet awareness that beyond official structures, there were civilians thinking about prisoners as people rather than positions, and that awareness settled gently into their thoughts without demanding a strong reaction. After the letters were folded and kept, the questions they raised did not disappear, because the mind continues to examine what does not fit easily into familiar patterns. And for men whose recent years have been shaped by clear divisions between sides, any action that blurred those divisions required careful thought. They began to consider possible explanations in a practical way, because practical thinking helped maintain balance in captivity, and one explanation was that civilian letter programs might exist to show humane treatment or to build cultural understanding, and this idea fit within the broader knowledge that wartime often included efforts beyond combat. Some reflected on international conventions and humanitarian groups that sometimes monitored prisoner conditions. And this framework offered a logical context, since correspondence could be encouraged as part of maintaining standards of treatment. And placing the letters inside this structure made them easier to interpret. Others focused less on policy and more on individual motivation, recognizing that some people simply write out of curiosity or moral belief, and that large societies contain many personal viewpoints. And this diversity of thought suggested that not every civilian action was directed by central authority. The content of the letters supported this view because the words were modest and personal rather than persuasive, and they avoided political language, which reduced the likelihood that they were meant as propaganda. And absence can be as informative as presence when reading carefully. Still, caution remained their default approach, because captivity teaches that intentions are not always visible at first glance, and measured interpretation protects the mind from disappointment or misunderstanding. And this cautious stance allowed them to acknowledge the gesture without assigning it more meaning than the evidence supported. They also recognized that communication across enemy lines has existed in many conflicts, often through regulated channels, and seeing their situation as part of a broader historical pattern helped normalize the experience, placing it within known practices rather than treating it as an isolated mystery. No one treated the letters as a sign of changing status, and no one assumed it signaled future shifts, because experience had shown that daily conditions rarely changed quickly, and separating small gestures from large expectations helped preserve emotional steadiness. The letters gradually became personal items rather than active questions, stored with other belongings, and their presence served as a reminder that civilian life beyond the camp included people aware of the war, but not defined entirely by it, and this awareness added nuance without altering reality. Over time, the initial confusion softened into understanding that wartime societies are complex, containing official policies, humanitarian efforts, and individual choices all at once. And recognizing this complexity helped them interpret the country around them with more detail and less assumption. In this way, the letters moved from being a puzzling event to becoming part of their broader picture of the outside world, a picture built slowly from small observations, where each detail added context without changing the boundaries of their confinement. As days passed, the letters slowly shifted from being a surprising event to becoming a quiet part of personal routine, because anything repeated or stored among daily belongings eventually loses its sharp edge, and the mind, especially in captivity, learns to normalize what it cannot change. Some men kept their letters folded carefully among their few possessions, not treating them as treasures and not discarding them either, but holding on to them as reference points, small pieces of contact with a civilian world that existed beyond the formal structures of guards and regulations. The camp itself did not change in response to the letters. The same schedules guided each day. The same counts confirmed presence, and the same work details filled the hours. And this consistency reminded them that gestures from outside did not automatically translate into differences inside, and separating symbol from reality remained an important mental habit. Occasionally, a man would reread a line, not searching for hidden meaning, but reviewing familiar words, because repetition sometimes brings clarity, and clarity often replaces uncertainty more effectively than speculation. And this quiet rereading reflected their preference for measured interpretation. Conversations about the letter stayed limited and calm, framed around facts rather than feelings, because practical discussion felt safer and more sustainable, and focusing on what was known helped avoid exaggeration or rumor, which could spread quickly in confined environments. They also observed that the guards treated the correspondence as routine, neither emphasizing it nor restricting it unusually, And this neutral handling suggested that the letters fit within accepted procedures rather than special arrangements. And neutrality often signals normal policy more than exceptional treatment. The presence of civilian voices on paper added a subtle layer to how they viewed the surrounding society, showing that outside the military system, there were individuals thinking about the war in personal ways, and recognizing this variety quietly expanded their understanding without challenging their caution. Still, they remained aware that written words travel more easily than people, and that communication does not erase distance. And this awareness kept their expectations grounded, because captivity had taught them that stability comes from accepting limits rather than testing them. Over time, the letters blended into the background of camp life, like familiar objects whose origins are remembered, but whose presence no longer surprises. And this blending showed how the mind adapts by placing unusual experiences into ordinary categories. By this stage, the letters were no longer questions waiting for answers, but examples of how civilian and military worlds intersect during war, and seeing them this way allowed the prisoners to store the experience as information rather than emotion, fitting it into the careful mental framework they used to understand their environment. As more time passed and the letters remained among their few personal items, the experience gradually settled into a broader understanding of how large societies function during conflict. Because war is carried out by governments and armies, yet lived through by civilians and individuals, and these different layers do not always move in the same way. They began to see the letters not as messages meant to change their situation and not as signals of special treatment, but as small human gestures that existed alongside official systems. And this distinction mattered, because separating personal action from policy helped them interpret events without confusion. The presence of those handwritten pages suggested that even in a country defined to them as the enemy, daily life still included people thinking in personal terms, writing from homes, farms, and towns, and this awareness added complexity to their mental picture of the outside world, showing it as a place of many viewpoints rather than a single unified voice. This realization did not reduce distance and did not create closeness, but it introduced nuance, and nuance often replaces simple categories when enough details accumulate, and prisoners who observed carefully tended to build their understanding piece by piece rather than through dramatic inclusions. They also recognized that correspondence across wartime lines has appeared in many conflicts, often encouraged through humanitarian or cultural channels, and placing their experience within this wider pattern helped them see it as part of history rather than a unique exception. No one assumed the letters represented friendship, and no one treated them as strategy alone, because balanced interpretation had become their safest habit, and balanced thinking allowed them to acknowledge the gesture without attaching expectations to it. Their daily priorities remained unchanged, focusing on routine, cooperation, and maintaining personal stability, because these factors shaped survival more than distant communication. And captivity often teaches that managing the present matters more than interpreting the outside. Still, the letters remained a quiet reminder that beyond official roles and wartime labels, individuals continue to act according to personal values. And this reminder broadened their perception without altering their reality, fitting naturally into the careful way they processed information. In the larger scale of the war, the letters were a small detail, but small details can influence how people understand the world around them. And for men living within limits, even minor insights contributed to a clearer mental map of the society beyond the fences. By the end, the correspondence became neither mystery nor message, but context, a simple example that war does not erase individual thought, and that even between opposing sides, ordinary people sometimes reach across distance with words, and recognizing this added depth to their understanding without changing the boundaries of their confinement. In the end, the letters did not change the fences, did not alter the schedules, and did not shift the rules that shaped each day. And yet they left behind a quiet piece of understanding, because they showed that beyond the official structures of war, there were still individual voices moving through ordinary life, writing from places untouched by barracks and guard towers. For the prisoners, this realization was not emotional and not dramatic, but practical because they had learned to treat new information as context rather than promise. And seeing the letters as part of civilian life helped them place the experience inside a larger picture instead of viewing it as a sign of change. The envelopes became simple objects among their belongings, reminders that communication can travel where people cannot, and that written words sometimes carry small fragments of another world into confined spaces without altering the limits of those spaces. What remained was not the content of any single message, but the idea that wartime societies are made of many layers: military systems, humanitarian channels, and private citizens acting on personal beliefs. And understanding these layers added depth to how they viewed the country around them. The camp continued in its steady rhythm, the days measured by routine, the environment defined by structure, and within that structure the letters found their quiet place as one detail among many observations gathered over time. And so the correspondence settled into memory as a modest example of how large conflicts still contain small human gestures, showing that even across distance and division, words can move between worlds, offering context without changing reality, and perspective without removing boundaries. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.